The night was dense, and the silence of the house was broken only by the sound of the wind against the window. I looked at my son, who lay curled up in bed, his face still marked by the terror of the previous night. His body trembled slightly, as if he were still trapped in the fear that consumed him. I should have felt relieved now that he was safe, but something inside me wouldn't allow it. Ever since my wife and I had found him frozen in bed, his eyes wide with pure horror, something had changed within me. I tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare, that everything was just a child's fear. But when he whispered, in a trembling voice, that she was still there, a chill ran down my spine. I couldn't sleep that night. At every little sound, I got up and checked his room. I wanted to see it with my own eyes, to find something that justified his deep fear. But what would I do if I actually found something? The next night, I decided to stay awake. I grabbed a chair and sat near his bedroom door, determined to keep watch. The hours dragged by, and my eyes grew heavy. For a moment, I thought I had dozed off. But then something woke me, a low sound, like a whisper coming from the corner of the room. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and for a moment, I thought I saw a silhouette there, a shadow that seemed denser than the surrounding darkness. My heart pounded in my chest. I blinked a few times, trying to convince myself it was just an illusion from my exhausted mind. But when I looked again, the shadow had moved. My first instinct was to turn on the light. In a quick motion, I pressed the switch by the door. The room lit up instantly, revealing only the furniture, the empty floor, and my son still asleep. The corner of the room was just as it had always been, filled with nothing but ordinary darkness. I ran a hand over my face, trying to shake off the paranoia. Maybe I was overreacting, being influenced by my son's fear. But deep down, something told me that this wouldn't be the last time I saw it. On the third night, it happened again. But this time, I wasn't just an observer. When I noticed the presence in the corner of the room, I felt my body freeze. My arms wouldn't move. My breathing grew heavy. I was fully awake, yet unable to react. That's when I heard the whisper again, much closer this time, as if it was right next to me. He has already seen me. My entire body shuddered. The room light flickered for a brief moment. When it stabilized, I could move again. I jumped up, looking around frantically, but there was nothing there. That night, I finally understood. The shadow wasn't just haunting my son. It could see me now too. The next morning, I woke up with a heavy head, as if I had spent the entire night fighting something invisible. My wife noticed my exhausted expression and asked if I was okay, but how could I explain what had happened? How could I say that something was inside that room watching us? I decided that I needed to understand what was going on. After dropping my son off at school, I spent the morning researching sleep paralysis. I read terrifying accounts of people who saw shadows during episodes, dark figures that seemed alive. But unlike most cases, my son wasn't just paralyzed, he was terrified. He said the shadow spoke to him, and now I had heard it too. As I read, a chill ran down my spine, a sensation that someone was behind me. I turned around suddenly, but the room was empty. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Maybe I was letting paranoia take over. Later, I tried talking to my son about what he was seeing. At first, he hesitated, just shaking his head. But when I assured him that I believed him, that it wasn't just a nightmare, he finally spoke. "She doesn't like it when you look," he whispered, avoiding my gaze. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. "Who is she?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He hesitated for a moment, then pointed to the dark corner of the room. The faceless woman. My heart pounded. He had never described the shadow this way before. A faceless woman? Something about those words filled me with indescribable dread. That night, I decided to install a camera in his room. If something was happening, I wanted proof. I set up the equipment before bed and forced myself to sleep. But in the middle of the night, I woke up with that familiar feeling of being watched. The room was dark, and I could hear my wife's soft breathing beside me. Then something caught my attention, a whisper coming from the hallway. I got up slowly and walked to my son's bedroom door. It was slightly open. My heart was pounding so hard it echoed in my ears. Cautiously, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was freezing. In the corner, a darkness darker than the night itself seemed to pulse. My body froze, the same paralysis from the other night taking over me. But this time, it wasn't just an invisible presence. Something moved within the shadow. A tall, slender figure, dressed in black, began to emerge from the darkness. My chest tightened as I realized she had no face, just an empty void where her eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. The room light flickered. A second later, she was gone. And then, my son's scream shattered the silence of the house. My son's scream almost made my heart stop. I rushed to his bed and found him curled up against the wall, trembling, his wide eyes fixed on the corner of the room. My instinct was to hug him, to protect him, but my gaze followed his, and for a moment I saw her again. The faceless woman. But this time, she didn't disappear. She moved slowly, as if gliding along the floor. Her body was enveloped in a darkness that seemed to absorb the little light in the room. With every step she took, the temperature dropped, and the smell of mold and something rotten filled the air. "Get out!" I shouted, not knowing if my words had any power against her. She stopped. Her empty face turned toward me, as if she could see me without eyes. For a moment, I thought she was going to leave. But then I heard her voice, not a regular sound, but a cold whisper that seemed to form directly in my head. "He is mine." A rage I couldn't control took over me. No matter what that thing was, I wouldn't allow it to touch my son. With a sudden movement, I charged at her. My body cut through the icy air like diving into freezing water, and then everything disappeared. I woke up on the floor of the room, my wife shaking me, her expression a mixture of worry and terror. "What happened?" "You were screaming." I looked to the side and saw my son sleeping peacefully, as if nothing had happened. The room was normal, without any sign of the faceless woman. But I knew that hadn't been a dream. The next day, I reviewed the camera footage. My heart raced when I realized the recording had captured something. At 3:14 a.m., the video showed the room suddenly darkening, as if a shadow had taken over the space. Then out of nowhere, the image trembled and became distorted. That's when I saw a slender silhouette emerging from the darkness. But that wasn't all. While the figure hovered in the corner of the room, my own body, sleeping beside my son, began to move, until suddenly I sat up rigidly, my head tilting to the side at an odd angle. My eyes were open, but they weren't mine. It was as if something was inside me. The video abruptly cut off, as if it had been corrupted. My blood ran cold. The faceless woman didn't just want my son. She had already been inside me. That night wasn't the end. It was just the beginning.